Hello, I'm Missy. I'm 20 years old, and I've spent my entire life on a horse ranch nestled in the rolling hills of Montana. Our ranch, Wildwood Stables, is my home, my sanctuary, and sometimes my whole world. There's something about the sound of hooves thundering against the earth, the scent of hay in the air, and the gentle nicker of a horse that makes me feel more alive than anything else. I've loved horses for as long as I can remember. Mom says that when I was a baby, the horses would lean their great heads over the fence to watch me, their soft eyes full of curiosity. As soon as I could walk, I'd toddle out to the paddocks, tiny hands reaching out to touch their velvety noses. There's a bond between us, something unspoken but deeply understood. Mom always says I'm just like her, strong-willed and independent. She's the kind of woman who wakes up before dawn, puts on her worn-out boots, and doesn't stop working until every horse is fed, every stall mucked out, and every piece of equipment is repaired. She's raised me single-handedly, pouring all her energy into the ranch and me. I know she loves me, but sometimes it feels like she's more comfortable talking to the horses than she is with people, including me. Then there's my dad, or more accurately, the absence of him. He's been in jail since before I was born. Mom never told me why, and I learned early on not to ask. He made his choices, she'd say, her mouth set in a tight line. That's all I get. So he's always been the shadowy figure in my life, someone I've wondered about but never truly known. Until recently. A few months ago, I found out he was being released. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to meet him to finally understand who he was. Another part of me felt loyal to Mom and her silence about him. When he showed up at the ranch unannounced, things got complicated. It was late afternoon when I saw him for the first time. I was brushing Daisy, my favorite mare, when a shadow fell across the barn door. I looked up and there he was. He's taller than I imagined, with a scruffy beard and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. "Missy," he said, his voice rough but warm. "It's me, your dad." I froze, the brush still in my hand. I didn't know what to say. He took a step closer, his hands raised as if I were a spooked horse he didn't want to scare off. "I've missed so much of your life," he said. "I just want a chance to know you." Mom found him before I could respond. She stormed into the barn, her face flushed with anger. "You have no right to be here, Dale," she snapped. "Get off my property." "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice low. "I just want to see my daughter." "Your daughter doesn't need you," Mom shot back. "You gave up that right a long time ago." He left that day, but he didn't stay away for long. He started showing up when Mom wasn't around, slipping onto the property like a ghost. At first, I was wary. But he had a way of talking that drew me in, spinning stories about his wild younger days and how he dreamed of working on the ranch with me. He made me laugh, and he listened when I talked about the horses or my dreams of competing in barrel racing. I'm not sure why, but I didn't tell Mom. Maybe I was afraid of how she'd react. Or maybe I just wanted to keep this piece of my life separate. For once, I felt like I had something that was mine. Meanwhile, things between Mom and Dad were getting worse. She caught him on the property a few times and threatened to call the police. One night, I overheard them arguing in the kitchen. "You don't belong here, Dale," Mom said, her voice trembling with anger. "You think you can just waltz back into our lives after what you did? After why you went to jail?" "I've changed," he said. "I'm trying to make things right." "You can't undo the past," she shot back. "And I won't let you drag Missy into it." I didn't understand what she meant, but her words stayed with me. What had he done that was so unforgivable? I wanted to ask, but I didn't know how. And honestly, part of me didn't want to know. Dad's visits became less frequent after that, and I found myself missing him. Despite everything, I felt a connection to him, a need to understand him. But I also felt torn between him and Mom. She'd sacrificed so much for me, and I didn't want to hurt her. Then, one day, everything changed. I was in the barn, saddling up Daisy for a ride, when I heard shouting. I ran outside and saw Mom and Dad near the paddock, their faces red with anger. "You need to leave," Mom said, her voice shaking. "Now. Missy deserves to know the truth." Dad said. She's not a little kid anymore. The truth? Mom said, her voice rising. You think telling her about your sick, twisted mistakes is going to help? She's better off without you. What mistakes? I asked, stepping closer. My heart was pounding. What are you talking about? They both turned to look at me, their faces filled with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, pain, maybe the weight of secrets they'd carried for too long. Mom hesitated, her eyes darting to Dad. You tell her, Dale, she said, her voice cold. Go ahead and ruin whatever image she has of you. Dad looked at me, his shoulders slumping. Missy, I went to jail because I made a mistake. A bad one. I was caught where I shouldn't have been, doing something I shouldn't have done. It's not something I'm proud of, and it's not something I can undo. I stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. What does that mean? I asked. What did you do? Mom stepped in. He got caught sneaking into a young girl's bathroom, Missy. That's the kind of man he is. The world seemed to tilt. I couldn't breathe. Dad tried to reach for me, but I stepped back. Missy, please, he said. I've changed. I want to make things right. But I couldn't hear him. All I could think about was the betrayal, the lies, and the confusion swirling in my mind. I turned and ran, leaving them both standing there. That night, I stayed out in the barn with Daisy, my heart aching. I didn't know how to reconcile the father I'd started to know with the man Mom had just revealed. I felt torn between wanting to believe he could change and fearing he never really had. The next morning, I made a decision. I confronted Dad one last time and told him he needed to leave for good. I can't trust you, I said, and I need time to figure out what this all means for me. Dad was like, yeah, sure, if that is what you want, but you have to do something for me. He pointed to Storm, our wildest stallion. That one's got spirit, he said. Bet you'd look nice being fucked by him. I shook my head, and that is when I realized that my dad was a very sick man. I wish I had listened to Mom. Dad's eyes lit up with a challenge. What do you say, Missy? Think you can do that for me? I laughed, thinking he was joking. But then I saw the look in his eyes. He was serious. No way, I said. That's weird and sick. Sick is part of the fun, he said, grinning. Come on, Missy, you've got it in you. You're my daughter, aren't you? Something about the way he said it made my heart race. I wanted to prove myself, to show him that I was brave and spontaneous, that I could do it. But Storm wasn't just any horse. He was wild, with a fire in his eyes that made even the most experienced riders wary. I can't, I said, shaking my head. It's not worth the risk. Dad's smile faded, and he looked away. Guess you're more like your mom than I thought, he muttered. That stung. I didn't say anything, but his words stayed with me long after he'd gone. I wanted to prove him wrong, to show him that I wasn't just some scared little girl. But I also knew that being fucked by Storm could end in disaster. It was a conflict I couldn't shake. I stood up and decided to leave this sick man alone. He jumped up and knocked me out clean with one punch. When I woke up, I was all naked and tied on all fours beneath Storm with a gag in my mouth. It was blurry, but I saw Dad gently massage Storm's 12-inch banana onto my cookie opening. The next thing I felt was a deep pain that penetrated till my stomach. It was so painful. Storm thrusted as if I was a female horse, and this amused my dad so much that he got out his camera and started filming. The pain was too much that I ended up fainting, and that sick man ran away after doing all this to me. When my mom found me, she drew the picture herself and called an ambulance and the police. Luckily, that sick man was put back in jail, and thanks to him, I now fear horses.
Hey, I am Jiwoo. I am the kind of girl who could stop time with my beauty. At 22, I have the kind of radiance that made people turn their heads in the streets of Bizen, and not just because of my striking appearance, but also the elegance with which I carried myself. My long, silky black hair cascaded down my back like a waterfall, and my pale porcelain skin seemed to glow under the sun. My eyes, almond-shaped and the color of dark chocolate, held an innocence that was both intriguing and disarming. People often said that my smile could light up even the darkest corners of the world, but I was far more than my beauty. There was a complexity about me, an emotional depth that few understood. I lived in a modest apartment with my single mother and my uncle, Dong-ho, my mother's younger brother. Our home sat close to Haeundae Beach, and I loved hearing the waves crash against the shore from my bedroom window. Life wasn't always easy, but my mother had worked hard to provide for me, and I admired her mom deeply for her strength and resilience. The absence of my father had never felt too profound because Dong-ho had always been there. He wasn't just my uncle, he was the man who stepped in to fill the gap my father had left behind. Dong-ho was 34, a tall and muscular man with a sharp jawline and features that could have graced the cover of any magazine. His eyes, much like mine, were deep and thoughtful, and he had an air of mystery about him. Despite his quiet nature, Dong-ho's presence was always felt in a room. He worked as a fitness instructor at a local gym, and every time he came home after his workouts, I found myself watching him more closely than I should. His sweat-drenched skin and the way his shirt clung to his well-defined body made my heart race. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help the attraction I had developed for him over the years. At first, I tried to ignore my feelings, brushing them off as a harmless crush. But the more I tried to distance myself, the more I found myself gravitating towards him. Every time he laughed, I felt a flutter in my chest. When he spoke to me, his deep voice would send a shiver down my spine. And when he smiled at me, it felt as though the world had stopped spinning, leaving just the two of us in our small universe. It didn't take long for me to start thinking of ways to get Dong-ho's attention, anything to make him notice me as something more than just his niece. The first thing I did was change my appearance. I knew how much Dong-ho admired strong, independent women, so I decided to enhance my natural beauty. I started going to the gym, not just to keep fit but also to spend more time around Dong-ho. We would often work out together, and every time, I would pick my most flattering outfits, tight leggings and fitted tops that accentuated my slender frame. I also began experimenting with makeup, not the heavy kind that looked overdone, but subtle touches that brought out my best features. I learned how to make my eyes look larger and more captivating, how to make my lips look fuller, and how to give my skin a flawless finish. Every time Dong-ho saw me, I could feel his gaze linger just a little longer, and that filled me with a rush of excitement. But despite my efforts, Dong-ho's reaction remained neutral. He would compliment me lightly, but it was always in a brotherly tone. "You look nice today, Ji-woo," he'd say with a soft smile. It wasn't enough. I wanted more. I needed him to see me as a woman, not just his niece. I decided that maybe I could reach him through his stomach. Dong-ho loved to cook, and on weekends, he would often prepare elaborate meals for the family. I started spending more time with him in the kitchen, offering to help with chopping vegetables or stirring sauces. I would stand close to him, brushing up against him accidentally, allowing my hand to linger on his when they passed utensils. I started wearing more revealing clothes at home, short skirts or dresses that showed off my legs, always pretending it was unintentional. I knew I looked good, and I could feel Dong-ho's eyes on me sometimes, but he never let it go further than that. He remained composed, even when I would accidentally drop something, bending down in front of him to pick it up, or when I would lean across him to grab a dish, making sure my body lightly grazed his. Still, despite my efforts, Dong-ho remained polite but distant. He would laugh off the awkward moments, but there was no sign that he felt the same way about me. I felt frustrated, but I wasn't ready to give up yet. One night, I decided to take a different approach. Dong-ho had always been a night owl, staying up late to watch TV or read, so I started doing the same. I would sit with him in the living room, asking him about his day, his thoughts, and his dreams. These late-night conversations allowed me to see a side of Dong-ho that was more vulnerable, more open. He would talk about his past relationships, his struggles, and his hopes for the future. I tried to steer the conversation towards love, dropping hints that I was interested in someone but never revealing who. What would you do, I asked one night, if someone close to you confessed their feelings for you? Dong-ho had smiled, a bit wistfully, before replying, it would depend. If I didn't feel the same way, I would try to let them down gently. Love isn't something you can force. My heart sank at his response, but I wasn't ready to give up. I needed to tell him how I felt. I couldn't keep pretending. The night of my confession was a rainy one. The sound of the rain beating against the windows seemed to mirror the intensity of my emotions. I had planned everything out in my mind, what I would say, how I would say it. My heart raced as I made my way to Dong-ho's room, where he was reading quietly on his bed. I knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. Dong-ho looked up, surprised to see me at such a late hour. Ji-woo, what's wrong? I need to talk to you, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I closed the door behind me and took a deep breath. My heart pounded in her chest as I sat down on the edge of his bed. Dong-ho put his book down, giving me his full attention. What's on your mind? I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his eyes. I've been feeling something for a while now, and I don't know how to say this, but I need to tell you. Dong-ho furrowed his brows, his expression growing serious. What is it, Ji-woo? I love you, I blurted out, my cheeks flushing red. I've been in love with you for a long time. I try to ignore it, but I can't anymore. You're all I think about, Dong-ho. For a moment, there was nothing but silence in the room. The weight of my confession hung in the air, and I felt as though the world had stopped. Dong-ho's expression softened, but not in the way I had hoped. He reached out and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. Ji-woo, he said softly, you're a beautiful, smart, and amazing woman, but I can't return your feelings. I felt my heart shatter into a million pieces. I had prepared myself for the possibility of rejection, but hearing the words still hurt more than I had imagined. You're my niece, Dong-ho continued, his voice gentle but firm. I care about you deeply, but not in that way. You mean the world to me, but this isn't right. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I fought to keep them from falling. I know it's wrong, I whispered, my voice barely audible. But I couldn't help how I felt. I thought maybe you felt the same. Dong-ho sighed and pulled me into a hug. You'll find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved, he said, stroking my hair, but it can't be me. You're too important to me to let this come between us. I buried my face in his chest, allowing myself to cry for the first time. I had always known that this moment would end in heartache, but now that it was real, the pain was overwhelming. After a while, Dong-ho pulled away and wiped the tears from her cheeks. You'll be okay, Ji-woo, he said softly, I promise. I nodded, though my heart felt like it was breaking beyond repair. I stood up and left his room, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that I had to let go. It would take time, but eventually, I would heal. I had to. A few moments later, I heard someone knock on my door. It was Dong-ho. Wow, more embarrassment for me, my mind said. Hardly had I asked him what he wanted than he entered my room and started passionately kissing me. The way he touched my skin sent shivers down my spine. He breaks the kiss and whispers under his heavy breath, that was a goodbye. He then gently walked away like nothing ever happened, and it was that night that I knew that I still had a chance with him.
I'm Laura. I never thought my life would become this complicated, but it did. I grew up in a world that others might envy. A huge mansion, the finest clothes, and all the luxuries money could buy. My mother, Miranda, was a successful businesswoman, always traveling the world, making deals and building her empire. She was brilliant, no doubt, but she was hardly around. As an only child, that meant I spent most of my days alone, surrounded by maids who made sure I had everything I needed, except companionship. But there was one person who always seemed to care. Leonard, my mom's best friend. He was her rock, her confidant, and the person she trusted more than anyone. Whenever she went on one of her long business trips, she would send Leonard to check on me. He would bring me gifts, ask how I was doing, and make sure I wasn't lonely. Over time, Leonard became more than just my mom's friend. He was kind, handsome, and everything I could have wanted. Tall, dark-haired, with piercing green eyes. He always dressed impeccably sharp suits, well-groomed hair, and a scent that lingered in the air long after he had left. He had this effortless charm that made everyone in his presence feel at ease, myself included. I began to realize that my heart would skip a beat whenever he walked into the room, and over time, my feelings for him grew into something more. A deep, burning desire I couldn't control. I knew it was wrong. Leonard was older than me, closer to my mother's age, and, more importantly, he saw me as just a kid, someone to look after while my mom was away. But that didn't stop me from trying. I wanted Leonard to notice me, not as the daughter of his best friend, but as a woman, and I would do anything to make that happen. It started with small things. I began paying more attention to the way I dressed whenever I knew Leonard was coming over. I used to throw on whatever was comfortable, a loose-fitting sweater or some old jeans, but that wasn't going to catch his attention. So, I started wearing tight-fitting clothes, dresses that hugged my curves, and low-cut tops that showed just enough to make him look twice. I would spend hours in front of my mirror, experimenting with makeup, trying to find the perfect combination that made me look older, more sophisticated. My blonde hair, which I usually wore in a messy bun or ponytail. I started styling differently, loose waves cascading over my shoulders, or sometimes sleek and straight, depending on the mood I was trying to create. My lips, once bare, were now painted in shades of red or pink, and my eyes were framed with eyeliner and mascara that made them pop. Every time Leonard came over, I would pretend it was just a casual outfit, but I could see him noticing. His eyes would linger for a second too long before he would look away, clearing his throat, as if he was trying not to think about it. But it wasn't enough. He still treated me the same, with that warm smile and those kind, protective eyes. He would ask me how school was going if I needed anything, and then he would leave, always just out of reach. I needed to do more. I needed to make him see me as more than just a girl. So, I came up with a new plan, something that would get his attention for sure. I would make him jealous. I figured if he thought I was interested in someone else, maybe he would realize how much he wanted me to. I started talking about a boy at school, Ethan. Of course, Ethan didn't really exist, but Leonard didn't know that. I told him how Ethan had asked me out, how we went on dates, and how much fun we had together. I made sure to drop little details every time Leonard came by. Ethan gave me these flowers, I would say, pointing to a bouquet I had bought myself. Or, Ethan said I looked beautiful in this dress, when I wore something particularly eye-catching. I could see Leonard's jaw tighten, just a little, whenever I mentioned Ethan's name. He would try to hide it, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it jealousy? I hoped it was. One evening, Leonard came over for dinner. I had spent the whole day preparing, choosing the perfect outfit, a silky red dress that clung to my body in all the right places. I made sure my makeup was flawless, my hair falling in soft waves down my back. During dinner, I casually brought up Ethan again, telling Leonard how Ethan had kissed me after our last date. For a moment, Leonard's fork paused mid-air, and I saw something flash across his face. Anger. No, it couldn't be. But before I could say anything else, Leonard forced a smile and said, "I'm glad you're happy, Laura. That's all that matters." My heart sank. No matter what I did, Leonard still saw me as a child, someone to protect, but not someone to desire. I needed to take things to the next level. I decided that subtlety wasn't working. If I wanted Leonard, I needed to be bold. One evening, after my mom had left for yet another business trip, I knew Leonard would be staying in the guest room at our mansion for the weekend. It was the perfect opportunity to make my move. I waited until late at night, slipping into a black silk nightgown that I had bought just for this occasion. It was short, barely reaching mid-thigh, and the thin straps left my shoulders bare. I applied a touch of lip gloss, my heart racing as I looked at myself in the mirror. I had never done anything like this before, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know how Leonard felt about me. With trembling hands, I quietly made my way down the hall to his room. The house was silent, the only sound the soft click of my footsteps on the marble floor. When I reached his door, I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. But then I knocked, softly at first, and then a little louder. "Come in," I heard Leonard's voice from the other side. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping into the dimly lit room. Leonard was sitting on the edge of the bed, his shirt unbuttoned and a book in his hands. He looked up at me, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw what I was wearing. "Laura, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a little rough, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. I took a deep breath, my pulse racing as I stepped closer to him. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Leonard stood up, setting the book aside and looking down at me with concern in his eyes. "Laura, whatever it is," I couldn't hold back anymore. All the emotions I had been feeling, all the longing and desire I had kept inside, came rushing out at once. "I love you, Leonard," I blurted out, my voice shaking. "I've loved you for so long. I can't stop thinking about you. I need you to know how I feel." Leonard's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. The silence stretched on, and I felt like I was going to break. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. But instead of the response I had hoped for, Leonard shook his head slowly. "Laura, you don't know what you're asking for," he said softly, taking a step closer. "I do," I insisted, stepping closer to him, my heart aching. "I know exactly how I feel. I've been trying to get your attention for so long, Leonard. I love you. Please just give me a chance." Leonard grabbed my waist and whispered in my ears, "Laura, you're young, so make sure your mom never finds out." Before I could even process what he had said, I felt his soft lips press against mine. It was so electrifying that I could feel my panty a little too wetter at the moment. He then shifted to my neck, giving me small bites, while caressing my boobs gently, like he was squeezing for juice out of them. My face turned pale for a moment, and the only thing I could hear were the gentle moans from my own mouth. In the deepest voice I've ever heard from him, he asked, "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I just nodded, unable to utter a single word. He then put he down and he undressed me slowly, while still giving me gentle kisses. I widened my legs, ready to receive him, but he didn't want to do it in missionary. He flipped me on all fours and he plunged my wet cookie with his big banana. Each plunge sent me to a different dimension, transcending time and space, as we mere mortals know it. I moaned harder on each thrust, inching closer to climax than before, but he kept a steady pace. When I finally came, I let out a big groan like a hungry lion, and I thought this was the end of it. But I was so wrong. He gently got up and told me to stay in my doggy position. He came with a lubricant and smeared it well on his banana and on my asshole. And before I could protest about how I have never had anal sex, and how I don't wish to have it, the banana was already in. I could feel each string of all my sphincters tear, but a sweat tear. He moved back there with gentleness and ease, and it even felt nicer than the designated hole. I had hardly started enjoying when he stopped and said, Oh, looks like we have an accident," he said with a smirk on his face. And there it was. I had shut on the bed. I felt so embarrassed that I ran away and cleaned myself up. Me and Leonard have never done it again, as we agreed to take our relationship slow while trying to figure out a way we shall tell Mom. But for now, let me keep enjoying my little secret with him. "Oh, my name is Jane. I'm a 17-year-old girl, living in what most people would call a dream life. Our family is wealthy, ridiculously so. My parents, Sandra and Robert, are the epitome of success, constantly traveling, attending high-profile parties, and mingling with celebrities, politicians, and anyone worth knowing in high society. I should feel lucky to be their daughter, but sometimes it's as though I barely exist in their world. The house we live in is grand, massive even, tucked away in the countryside, away from the noise of the city. Every inch of it is designed to impress. Marble floors, grand chandeliers, art pieces that could probably feed an entire town for a year. But to me, it's just home, empty. Our house has that old English feel to it, wooden beams, high ceilings, fireplaces in nearly every room, although we rarely use them. There's a grand staircase that curls up to the second floor where my room is. It's beautifully decorated in soft whites and pastel colors, and my massive bed faces a bay window that overlooks the garden. The garden, a masterpiece of landscaping, is often where I find myself when I want to escape the silence of the house. Even though it's peaceful, I've grown tired of the perfection. Every plant is placed just right, every hedge trimmed to precision. It feels lifeless, like everything else in this place. Then there's Jake, my twin brother. We were inseparable as kids. But that all changed 2 years ago when he was sent to a prestigious boarding school in the UK. Our parents thought that was the best decision for him, but I was left behind to stay at home. I've always wondered why they didn't send me too, but I suppose they thought I'd be better off here, in this huge house with the occasional visits from nannies and tutors. I missed Jake terribly at first. We used to do everything together: prank our tutors, explore the woods behind the house, stay up late whispering about everything and nothing. He was my best friend, but life went on without him. And now, after 2 long years, he was coming back home. I was excited at first, imagining the fun we'd have, just like before. But the moment I saw him at the airport, I felt something I hadn't expected. He had changed. He wasn't the lanky boy I remembered. He had grown taller, broader, more confident. His hair was neatly styled, and when he spoke, his voice had this rich British accent that made me do a double take. He looked like a stranger, not the Jake I had once known so well. We drove home in awkward silence, at least for me. He seemed at ease, talking about his school, his friends, his life in the UK. I could barely concentrate on what he was saying. I was too busy studying his face, the sharpness of his jawline, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. My heart raced in a way that made me feel ashamed, confused. This was my brother, but why did he seem so different? That night, lying in bed, I tried to shake the feeling. But over the next few days, it only grew stronger. Jake settled back into life at home, but he wasn't the same boy I used to know. He carried himself with this new air of sophistication, as if he had outgrown everything, including me. He didn't seem to care much about rekindling the bond we once had. He spent most of his time in his room, reading or on his laptop, and when we did talk, it was light and casual, nothing like the deep conversations we used to have. I tried to ignore the way my stomach flipped every time he walked by, or the way I'd stare a little too long when he was lost in thought. I told myself it was just because I hadn't seen him in so long, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I started doing little things to get his attention. I'd wear dresses I knew would make me look pretty, make sure my hair was done just right, even if we were just lounging around the house. I'd laugh a little too hard at his jokes, stand a little too close when we talked, but it didn't seem to make a difference. He was polite, kind even, but distant. It was like I didn't exist in the way I wanted to. One night, after dinner, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know if he felt the same way. I waited until I heard the water running from the shower in his room, my heart pounding as I walked down the hall. What was I doing? This was crazy. But I was past the point of reason. When I heard the shower turn off, I pushed the door open slightly and stepped inside. Jake was standing there, just a towel wrapped around his waist, droplets of water still clinging to his skin. He looked startled when he saw me, his eyes narrowing in confusion. I took a deep breath. "Jane, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp but not angry. I stepped closer, my throat dry. "I need to tell you something," I whispered. My hands were trembling, and I could barely meet his eyes. Jake frowned, his eyes scanning my face. "What's going on?" I like you, Jake," I blurted out, my voice barely above a whisper. "More than just a brother. I don't know when it happened, but I can't stop thinking about you." For a moment, the room felt frozen. Jake's expression was unreadable, and I felt a wave of panic. What had I just done? "No, Jane," he said finally, his voice firm. "This isn't right. We're siblings. This can't happen." I felt tears sting my eyes, embarrassment burning through me. "But I can't help it," I whispered. "I've tried, but I can't stop feeling this way." Jake shook his head, stepping back from me. "You have to stop. This isn't okay. I'm your brother, Jane. It doesn't matter what you think you feel." I didn't know what to say. My heart was breaking, not just from rejection, but from the shame that I had even let myself get to this point. Without another word, I turned and fled the room, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my own bed. For days after that, I tried to act like nothing had happened. Jake, to his credit, didn't bring it up. He continued to be polite, distant, as if we hadn't shared that moment in his room. But I couldn't let it go. Every time I saw him, the feelings came rushing back. I still tried to catch his eye, still dressed up, still laughed at his jokes, but it was no use. Then one night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a knock on my door. I sat up, my heart racing. It was Jake. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. He looked tired, worn out, like he'd been carrying a heavy weight. "Jane, please," he said quietly, sitting on the edge of my bed. "You have to stop this." I looked down, ashamed again. "I can't help it," I whispered. "You have to try, because I don't know how much longer I can resist you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm your brother. We grew up together. This isn't right." "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I know it's wrong, but I don't know how to stop." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're my sister, Jane. I love you, but not in the way you want me to. You have to see that." I nodded, tears filling my eyes again. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He reached out and squeezed my hand, his touch warm and comforting. "I don't want to lose you," he said softly. "We were always so close. I don't want this to ruin everything." I nodded again, wiping my eyes. "I'll try," I said, though my heart felt heavy. "I'll try to stop." Jake gave me a small peck on the cheek, and in that moment I didn't care about the consequences, but I had to have him. I wrapped my hands around him, not letting go, till he felt the warmth in between my thighs. And as I expected, the plan worked. Jack moved his hand, gently tracing the arch of my back, till I could feel his hands on my bums. He gently caressed them while heavy breathing on my neck, like he was some lion ready to eat. For a second I pushed him away and looked in his eyes and said, "You can have me for tonight. I won't tell anyone if you don't." And those were the only words he needed. Jack tore off my nightie dress like it was made of paper. He then put his gentle lips on mine, and every kiss sent shivers down my spine. He kissed me so softly while gently caressing my nipples. He then pulled out his huge banana. Oh my God, it was so huge that I felt my legs shiver for a bit. Was this whole big thing going to be plunged in me? I wondered. I then gave him a slight push, and he lay flat on the bed, his legs apart. I sucked the banana so hard, till I could see his toes curl. Every suck I gave him sent jolts of electricity through his body. I had Jake beg for mercy within minutes. I then sat on him, pushing his banana into me slowly. I rode him like my little pony, till he gave up and came in me. We lay side by side that night, not thinking about what we had done. The house felt colder after that night. Jake and I didn't speak, not even a glance exchanged in the hallways. Every moment was heavy with the weight of what we had done. That sex, our bodies pressed together in the heat of the moment, was wrong in every possible way. The guilt gnawed at me, twisting my stomach every time I thought about it. But I couldn't forget how it had felt either. My mind was at war with itself, part of me wanting to justify it, another part knowing it could never be. I stayed in my room for days, avoiding Jake as much as I could. I'd hear him downstairs, moving around, his presence filling the house like an invisible shadow. Every time I thought about facing him, I felt sick with shame. How could I look at him after what we did? How could I ever talk to him like we were normal siblings again? We crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and I didn't know if things could ever be the same. My parents, as usual, were away, so there was no one to notice the growing distance between us. They were off at some gala in the city, probably mingling with their famous friends, oblivious to the turmoil happening in their own home. When I finally left my room, I would move around the house quietly, careful to avoid the places where I knew Jake might be. I ate quickly, barely sitting down before retreating back upstairs. The silence between us was unbearable, but I didn't know how to break it. It wasn't just the guilt that was suffocating me, though. There was something else, a tension that I couldn't quite explain. As much as I knew what we did was wrong, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the heat of that kiss all over again. It scared me how much I wanted to feel that way again, and it made me hate myself even more. One afternoon, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Jake knocked on my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen for a moment, unsure if I should let him in. But I knew we couldn't keep avoiding each other forever. I opened the door, and there he stood, his face pale, his eyes downcast. He looked as guilty as I felt, and seeing him like that made something in me ache. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I nodded and stepped aside, letting him into my room. The air between us was thick with unspoken words. He sat on the edge of my bed, and I sat next to him, both of us staring at the floor. "I'm sorry," he said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. "What we did, it was wrong. I don't know what happened, but I can't stop thinking about how much we've messed everything up." I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. "I feel the same. I don't know why it happened, but I can't keep pretending like it didn't. We can't let it ruin us, Jake." He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to lose you. You're my sister, Jane. We have to put this behind us. Promise me we won't let it happen again." "I promise," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It won't happen again." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of our words hanging in the air. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was something. We both knew that we had to move on, no matter how hard it would be. We couldn't let this one mistake destroy everything. I'm Olivia. I thought this summer would be different. 19 felt like an age where things were supposed to change. I'd finished my first year of college and moved back home for the break. Yet, everything felt the same, maybe even lonelier. My mom, Clara, had remarried a few years ago. Her husband, Tom, was kind, but I never quite felt comfortable with the term stepdad. He wasn't overbearing or intrusive, just present. He had a steady calmness about him, the kind of man who always had time to listen, even when you didn't think you needed it. My mom adored him, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. They were a good match, even if their dynamic made me feel like the odd one out in our small household. I loved my mom. She was resilient, vibrant, but after her divorce from my dad, I think she learned to protect herself by focusing on her own happiness. She and Tom would go out for dinners. It wasn't that they didn't care about me, they did, in their way, but I often felt like a guest in their world rather than a part of it. Loneliness had become a quiet companion of mine. At college I had friends, but not the kind you confide in deeply. Back home, the feeling of isolation grew sharper. I'd retreat to my room, spending hours scrolling through social media or binge-watching shows. Somewhere along the way, I developed a habit that I wasn't proud of, a coping mechanism for the emptiness I felt. I would open a porn site and touch myself till I came. It became a cycle. I'd feel lonely, touch myself, and then feel guilty afterward. I wanted to stop. I really did. It wasn't just about the habit itself. It was about what it represented. It was a reminder of how disconnected I felt, how much I yearned for something more meaningful in my life. I'd try to quit, setting resolutions that I'd break within days. Each time I failed, the shame would weigh heavier, convincing me that I was stuck in this loop forever. One evening, I sat on my bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Mom and Tom had gone out for one of their Friday dinners. I told myself this time would be different. I'd write in my journal, maybe read a book, anything to distract myself. But distractions only worked for so long, and I found myself slipping back into old patterns. I gently slid off my panties and started fingering myself, while imagining some hot guy at school called Sheldon. I came the first time, but that wasn't enough. It hadn't quenched my thirst. Earlier, I had managed to secretly learn how to satisfy myself with my banana-shaped deodorant. I would smear some saliva on top of it, then gently rub it on top of my lips down there. Before my pelvis gave way, and it would sink in so easily, I thrusted it in and out, and I came a minimum of 5 times. Honestly, I don't remember. I stopped counting. That's when it happened. The door to my room opened, and there was Tom, standing in the doorway. I froze, mortified. His expression shifted quickly from surprise to something softer, more concerned. "Oh, Olivia," he said, backing out immediately. "I'm so sorry. I should have knocked." My face burned with embarrassment. "It's fine," I muttered. Not meeting his eyes, he lingered for a moment, then closed the door. I sat there, heart pounding, wishing I could disappear. What now would he tell my mom? Would he think less of me? The questions swirled in my head, making it impossible to focus on anything else. The next day, Tom approached me in the kitchen. My mom was in the garden, tending to her plants. It was just the two of us. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked gently. I nodded, my stomach twisting into knots. And he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Olivia, about last night," he began. I wanted to shrink into myself. "Please don't tell Mom," I blurted out. He raised his hands in reassurance. "I won't. This isn't about that. I just want to make sure you're okay." His words caught me off guard. I expected judgment or awkwardness, not genuine concern. "I'm fine," I said quickly. But the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "Olivia," he said, his tone steady and kind. "It's okay to feel lonely, and it's okay to look for ways to cope. But I think you're carrying a lot of guilt, and that's not healthy." I stared at the table, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't know how to stop," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded thoughtfully. "Habits like this often come from a deeper place. It's not about willpower. It's about understanding what you're really feeling and finding better ways to address it." "Like what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "For starters, you might need more connection in your life," he said. "It sounds like you've been feeling isolated. Maybe we can work on that together." His offer surprised me. "You'd help me?" "Of course," he said, without hesitation. "You're part of this family, Olivia. I care about you." That was the first time I truly believed him. Over the next few weeks, Tom made an effort to include me in more activities. He'd invite me to join him and Mom on their outings, or suggest we cook dinner together. He even encouraged me to pick up a new hobby, something creative that could help redirect my energy. I decided to try painting, and while I wasn't great at it, I found the process surprisingly therapeutic. Tom also introduced me to mindfulness exercises. Sometimes, just sitting with your feelings instead of trying to push them away can make a big difference. We'd spend a few minutes each morning practicing deep breathing or focusing on the present moment. It felt awkward at first, but over time, it helped me feel more grounded. The changes didn't happen overnight. There were still moments when I struggled. But having Tom's support made a world of difference. He never judged me, never made me feel like I was broken. Instead, he reminded me that everyone has their battles and that it's okay to ask for help. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I turned to him. "Thank you," I said simply. He smiled. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For helping me see that I'm not alone." He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You've done the hard work, Olivia. I'm just here to remind you that you don't have to do it alone." As summer turned to fall and I prepared to head back to college, I felt a newfound sense of hope. I wasn't perfect, and I still had a lot to figure out, but I knew I was on the right path. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so alone. Hi, I'm Anne, a mother of two and a successful lawyer. Life has always been busy, sometimes chaotic, but I love it. I'm the kind of person who thrives under pressure, whether it's in the courtroom defending a client or at home managing my family. I have twin daughters, Lily and Sophie, who are the light of my life. They're 10 years old, full of energy, and have a bond that's unbreakable. My husband, Pierre, is wonderful, kind, supportive, and always there for me when I need him. But Pierre has a past that involves Theo. Theo is Pierre's son from his first marriage. Pierre and his ex-wife had a rough divorce before we met, and Theo stayed with his mother. He's 17 now, a teenager with all the complexities that come with that age. I've always known about Theo, but he hasn't been a big part of our lives. We'd see him on the occasional weekend, during holidays, but he's never lived with us for any real stretch of time. This summer that changed. Theo was suspended from school after a heated argument with a teacher. According to Pierre, it wasn't just a typical spat, was enough to cause a major stir, and Theo's mother was at her wit's end. She didn't know what to do with him, so Pierre suggested Theo come stay with us for a while to get a change of scenery and maybe learn some discipline. At first, I was hesitant. We had our routine, our family dynamic. Theo was a teenager with his own set of problems, and I wasn't sure how well he would fit in with our household. But Pierre insisted, and I could see the worry in his eyes. He felt guilty about not being there more for his son. I couldn't say no. When Theo arrived, it was awkward at first. He was quiet, distant, barely saying anything beyond the obligatory hello when I greeted him at the door, but the twins were excited to have their half-brother around. They idolized him in the way little kids do with older siblings, following him around the house, asking him about school, music, and everything else under the sun. Surprisingly, Theo was gentle with them, patient even, and over time, the awkwardness between us began to fade. Still, something shifted inside me, something I wasn't prepared for. Theo wasn't the little boy I had known from weekend visits. He had grown into a tall, handsome young man with the kind of quiet confidence that's hard to ignore. He was smart, too, sharper than I had given him credit for. The more I observed him, the more I found myself drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain, or rather, I didn't want to explain. It was wrong, inappropriate. I was his stepmother, married to his father. But these feelings began to grow like an unwanted weed. At first, I brushed it off as a harmless crush. I'd see him sitting at the kitchen table, reading a book or playing a video game, and I'd catch myself staring. I told myself it was nothing. But the more I tried to suppress it, the stronger it became. I began doing small things to get his attention, little acts that were subtle enough to seem innocent, but deep down, I knew they weren't. I would dress a little nicer. Maybe wear a blouse that showed off more than it should. Or I'd linger just a bit longer in the living room when he was watching TV, hoping for some acknowledgement, a look, anything. But Theo didn't seem to notice. He was polite, of course, respectful, but indifferent to my attempts to get closer. He spent most of his time with the girls or in his room, working on school assignments or listening to music. I tried to convince myself that it was for the best, that it was better if he didn't notice. Yet, every time I caught a glimpse of him, his strong jawline, the way his hair fell across his forehead. I couldn't help but feel this strange mixture of excitement and shame. One night, I found myself unable to sleep. Pierre was snoring softly beside me, but my mind was elsewhere, swirling with thoughts I knew I shouldn't be having. I thought about Theo, the way he smiled when Lily or Sophie made a silly joke, the way he moved with such ease, I had been pretending for weeks that these feelings were manageable, but now they were suffocating me. I got out of bed. I didn't know what I was going to do maybe. I just needed to see him, to talk to him. I convinced myself that if I could just get it off my chest, if I could confess my feelings, I would feel better. I wasn't thinking clearly. All I knew was that I needed to act, to say something, before this twisted obsession consumed me. I made my way down the hall to Theo's room. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner. My hand trembled as I reached for his door. I hesitated, but then I knocked softly. There was no answer, so I slowly opened the door and stepped inside. Theo was sitting up in bed, his laptop on his lap. He looked surprised to see me, but not alarmed. "Anne," he said, his voice calm but curious. I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. I need to talk to you," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. He closed his laptop and set it aside, his eyes on me. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said, feeling the weight of my confession pressing down on me. "I don't think things are okay. I've been feeling something, and I don't know how to deal with it." Theo's expression shifted, a look of confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" I took a step closer, my heart racing. "I've been thinking about you, Theo, more than I should. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. I don't know what to do with these feelings." There I had said it. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. Theo's face darkened, and for a moment he was silent. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "Anne, no," he said firmly, his voice low but steady. "This isn't right. You're my stepmother. You're married to my dad." "I know," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "But I can't help it." Theo stood up, his posture rigid. "You have to stop this," he said, his tone more forceful now. "Whatever you're feeling, it's not real. It's not okay. You need to think about Dad, about the girls." His words hit me like a cold slap to the face. He was right. I had let myself spiral into this fantasy, this sick delusion, without thinking about the consequences. My marriage, my family, they were all at risk because of my selfish desires. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know what I was thinking." Theo's expression softened, but he didn't move closer. "I think you need to go," he said quietly. "We'll forget this ever happened." I nodded, my chest tightening with a mix of relief and shame. I turned and left his room, closing the door softly behind me. As I made my way back to my bedroom, the weight of what had just happened settled over me. I felt sick to my stomach. What had I done? I had almost thrown everything away, my marriage, my family, because of a momentary lapse in judgment. I crawled back into bed next to Pierre, who was still sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me. In the days that followed, I focused on my work, my daughters, and my marriage. Theo remained polite but distant, and I knew it was for the best. We never spoke about that night again, and slowly I began to put it behind me.